Great. So welcome to the Computer Science and Digital Fluency Standards webinar. It's amazing to see how many people are here. It looks like we have 49 participants, which is absolutely crazy for a Tuesday at 3 p.m. So thank you all so much. I would like to introduce our two presenters today, Andrea and David. Are you guys able to unmute? I think I muted everyone, but I think it's co-host.
Yep.
Hi, thank you. It's great to be here. My name is Andrea Tejador. I'm the Assistant Superintendent in Highland Falls, New York, but I also am involved. I'm the Hudson Valley Regional Director for NYSED, for the Board of Directors, and very involved with the standards from the beginning. And I'm excited to be here. I'm glad Lisa Blank, David Chakowski, Eric Shoemaker, all folks that I've been working with to do this, and it's great to be here. David?
Sure. David Chakowski. I'm a high school teacher in beautiful Hyde Park, New York, right in the Hudson Valley. We've got the best beautiful geography and fantastic location. I'm glad to be a part of this. I've had the chance over the last 5 years to teach computer science classes that have grown, which is what I wanted to do when I started, when I became an educator 15 years ago. And I finally had that, and the response has been amazing in our school to where I'm now a full-time computer science teacher. And as a result, I've also been able to work with colleagues of mine like Eric, who is here in my regional computer science teachers association. We are two of the leaders in the region. And I also am involved with the National Computer Science Teachers Association as well.
So we're going to keep everyone for about 45 minutes. The first part of this is just going to be talking about some of the background and motivations of the standards. We're going to be sharing worksheets with examples that you can hopefully use in your district. And then we're going to be going over some of the transdisciplinary options and possibilities for the standards as well. And then we have about 10 minutes at the end for Q&A, just so you have an idea of what to expect. And so with that, I will pass it off to our main presenters to start the presentation.
Okay, I'm going to share my screen. Let's see, here we go. So we're going to start off with an overview of the standards. And last week we actually did have a great meetup, and Lisa Blank is here, and she was a part of that. And Lisa, David, please chime in whenever you want related to this work. You know, I actually stole this from Lisa, so it's good that we're sharing and working together. So the computer science digital fluency standards, these are the 5 concept areas that are now included in the standards. After a lengthy revision process, this is where it landed. And we do have a timeline in here, and we'll go over that timeline. But these are the 5 concept areas. Impacts of computing, computational thinking, networks and systems, cybersecurity, and digital literacy. In November of 2018, there was an open call for authoring committee members, and that process started within the year. You know, the first draft was finished in 2019. I was involved in the early part of authoring the standards. I was specifically a part of the digital literacy concept area. And once we finished that first draft, we put it out there for public comment. There were over 800 responses. And that's when Lisa and David got involved with sort of that review of that first draft and the rewriting of the standards. And then the regents took a look at it, and they decided they wanted more early childhood input. And in terms of looking at the K1 versus grades 2, 3, and you'll see how they were ultimately broken up. And in December of 2020, they received approval. Lisa, did you want to add anything more about that timeline and that process?
So I will jump in at this point and mention that there is a link there, and I apologize, I can't even remember all of the 120 individuals that were involved. It's a huge list, and I wouldn't be surprised if there are several more of you have done that and have contributed even in some of those 800 responses that came from the state. So thank you all who have participated in this. It's a fantastic document, and part of what makes it so fantastic is the number of people who contributed to that. So I've been proud to have been a part of it from the early stages of setting some of those initial guiding principles all the way through to some of the final revisions. But to see the number of people and the variety of voices that were involved in this, it's a really fantastic document, and I'm glad to have been through that process with State Ed.
Yeah, absolutely. I agree. So, David, you want to take it over and talk about the standards at a glance and how the grade bands have changed?
Yep. So if you did get a chance before the final revision was approved, and that was in the middle of December, so if you saw any of the standards prior to mid-December, you were likely looking at a draft that has gone through a major revision of the grade banding. And you're familiar with the grade bands in any of the state's other standards. These are somewhat unique in that they've kind of grouped the standards into a range of grades. So you may have looked at them and noticed that there had been a K2, 3, 5, 6, 8, and 9, 12 grade bands. After the regents brought in more early childhood educators and experts in that area, they reorganized, and as a result, what was 4 bands became 5. And so that early childhood matches more of where the appropriate developmental stage of the students are. So we now have a K1 grade band, a 2-3 grade band, 4-6 middle school and high school. Along the lines with being grade bands, what's interesting is that as you see these standards, to realize that it is multiple years that these standards are to be taught at, not necessarily that they all have to be taught in one single year. So some of the revisions that have happened, I'm not sure if you've had a chance where you may have jumped in and started following some of the process here, but some of the major revisions that happened, as I mentioned, a lot of attention needed to go into the K2, so much that they broke that apart into 2 different grade bands. 3rd grade needed to get moved up to band with 2nd grade. So a lot of early childhood revisions in this final draft. These are kind of the major revisions that happened after draft 2 and were before the final draft presented to the Board of Regents for approval. If you did have a chance to look at the earlier drafts, there were a lot of examples included in with the standards, which are very helpful to teachers to understand what this might look like in the classroom. However, those aren't actual standards and are by no means intended to be expectations of how they'll be taught. So State Ed specifically pulled those out. So when you see the revision, when you see the standards document, you won't see examples in the official standards document. However, State Ed does provide lots of examples in supplementary materials as well. So within the 5 concept areas, impacts of computing, computational thinking, network and system design, cybersecurity, and digital literacy, each of those has a sub-concept area, 3 or 4 of those in each. And then those have standards within them. So we're kind of just breaking this down smaller and smaller. All in all, there are about 35 standards total per grade band. So K1, there are approximately 35 standards. 2-3, there are approximately 35 standards. So these are the standards, and you'll notice that they are grouped. So there's about 7 in each of the concept areas. Some of them have a little more computational thinking, some a little bit less. The numbers are not indicative of sequential need. In fact, neither are the concept areas. These are kind of intended to be entered at any point and brought in various places. So the arrangement of these standards is purely for organization, not for sequencing along with it. Same thing with the standard numbers themselves, not about sequencing. It's just to give you an idea of what you're looking at. So we'll move to the next slide. So as we dig into the document, which Andrea did post a link to, if you haven't had a chance, I'd encourage you to go to the State Ed website. And the very first link, so as you scroll down, the very first PDF link is the document. It's about 35, 40 pages long, large introductory section. And then as you scroll, the major chunk of it are a whole bunch of tables of all of these standards. In those tables, you'll see kind of what you see here on the right side of this slide. You'll see each table has the columns that indicate the grade banding. And then there's the standard identifier, which is a code used for referencing the standards, which is very common. We see these in all the next gen standards as well. That code for you to understand what that means is the grade band first, dot, then the concept area. So there are those 5 concept areas, and then the standard number. So in the actual tables themselves, you'll see that standard identifier, that code to indicate the standard. You'll see the actual text of the official standard, and then any clarifying statement to draw your attention to what's the really important piece in this standard that we should be focusing on. So here is one page out of the standards document. This happens to be the computational thinking, which in this case is this aqua green almost color. And so all of the computational thinking standards are this color. So as you're flipping through the document, that'll help you find where you are and kind of contextualize you a little bit. One of the things that I really like about this organization of the standards is you can see the overall progression that a student will have going from kindergarten, learning about data analysis and visualization, which is one of the sub-concepts of computational thinking, and what that would look like in a 2-3, then to a 4-6, to a 7-8, and then the final graduation metric for a 9 through 12. And you see the progression across the years. However, this document, this organization may not be so useful when you're presenting it at different grade levels. So State Ed has also provided these standards broken out into individual grades, which I think is one of the next slides. This slide actually does have 2, so you'll see some of the pages have 2 standards, 2 bands of standards on them. This one has the CT3 and CT4 on it. Those are what are in the rows. Okay, so then talking about the rollout for adoption, we are right now, December 14th is when the standards were officially adopted by the Board of Regents. So we are in an awareness building, which you all attending this is helping to build awareness of what these standards are. So thank you all for seeking out this information, but part of it will, the only way we get this information shared out is when we kind of exponentially, if we each share it to 2 more people, kind of a thing. If it just stays where Leandra, Andrea, and I are talking to people, this is going to be a very slow awareness session. So you're at the stage where we need to just be making our colleagues aware that these even exist. All right, so we're at adoption through the end of this school year. It's about just letting folks know that these things exist. Then we enter into a kind of capacity building where we're saying, okay, those are the standards. What's this going to look like in the classrooms? I know of many districts that are already starting to say, okay, how are we going to accomplish these standards? And they're forming interdisciplinary groups of, say, STEM committees to say, okay, how will these standards be implemented in our school? We'll talk about those details in a little bit. So that's through August 2023. Year 1 implementation, this is for folks in particular, this is where I'm going to be most impacted. September 2023 is when all credit-bearing computer science courses are to be aligned with New York State CS and DF standards. So high school is pretty much the only spot you're going to find those computer science specific classes. So really, there's still another year of capacity building as we look at what this looks at the other grade levels and in other subject areas. But then we're into full implementation. The goal is to have these standards fully integrated and planned and working by September 2024.
And there is a lot of crossover between these standards and the next generation learning standards. So if you look at the keyboarding, for example, that's a part of the digital literacy concept area, you'll see those same standards reflected in the next generation learning standards for ELA. Similarly, a lot of what you'll see in the algorithm section is reflected in the math standards. So there are opportunities to make connections between what's happening now with your rollout of the next generation learning standards and also these standards as you start to plan for the full implementation in 2024. I would venture to guess some of what is already in these standards is already happening in your districts as you move towards that full implementation of the next generation learning standards effective, September.
So this is the vision, and I think it's important that we actually take the time to think about why this is even happening. This was one of the initial things that state ed wanted to do when they began this process back in 2018. And this was kind of the vision that was settled on why we're even doing this. And that is every student will know how to live productively and safely in a technology-dominated world. This includes understanding the essential features of digital technologies, why and how they work, and how to communicate and create using those technologies. I think it's become somewhat painfully obvious that we live in a technology-dominated world, and this pandemic has really driven that home, right? This vision statement wasn't written in a pandemic world. This vision statement was what was set forward back in 2018 as to why should all students, every student, be engaging with computer science and digital fluency standards. So just taking a very cursory view of the 5 concept areas to kind of give you a taste for what you'll see within the standards here. So we're just going to run through the 5 major concept areas. The first one being impacts of computing is really looking at how is computing changing us and how are we changing computing. Again, I mean, you want to talk about the news when we start talking about how is computing and technology impacting and influencing politics in a way that we've not seen before. Really interesting how we can't be ignoring the impacts of computing, which leads into great interdisciplinary connections here, right? So these standards are not just, hey, let's teach coding, but let's look at what are the impacts of computing nationally, globally, locally, right? What are some of the perspectives that we need to have on how it has an impact on society? Right, so these are not just coding standards. Next slide, please. So computational thinking, this is where you're going to get more into what you would think of as your traditional coding type standards. However, I'd like you to look beyond coding and think of this as a computational thinking, the idea of decomposition, generalization. These are things we see in math classes, abstraction, pattern recognition, and then even algorithmic design. These are things that don't have to be tied to a computer. The example I often use is when you're sorting your socks. There is an algorithm for how you're doing that. You take out a sock from the basket, you take out the next sock from a basket. If they match, great. But if they don't, do you put the one sock back into the basket and then dig out another? That's an algorithm that you're following to sort socks. We don't need to say that computational thinking has to have a computing device in front of you. Right, systematizing, decomposing the task of folding laundry into individual tasks. Right, so these are skills that exist beyond just writing computer code.
And David, I love what you said last night at the presentation that you did, where you said the standards were written, the early levels of the standards were written so that computers weren't necessarily needed, right?
Yeah.
Many of these skills can be taught without having the students use computers at all.
Yeah, that is actually, and I'll mention that here because I think it's really important, and we may even revisit it because of how important it is. The early grades, the kindergarten through, I believe, 6th grade, those standards are specifically written so that they can be taught without a computing device. And that's a huge thing. Now, if you've ever heard of computer science unplugged, that's been talked about since the 90s of how can we teach these concepts without having to put a screen in front of a child. So networks and system design, this is a little bit of the idea of, well, we've got computers, great, but our computers don't work in isolation. So how is it that computing devices communicate? Which is really neat, because when I communicate with you in person, we're doing networking, right? We call that networking. If we were all in person having this, we'd have a time of networking. Well, that happens on computing devices as well. And so we look at how can digital devices do that? And how does that facilitate innovation? Cybersecurity, this is 1/5 of the standards here. And this is one of the things that New York State is really leading the way on, is acknowledging the fact that cybersecurity is an important piece that needs to be addressed, not just as a job profession that we're exposing students to, but cybersecurity is a way of engaging with computers. And if you engage with a computer, you are impacted and must practice cybersecurity. Right? What are the actions you need to be doing? What are the mindsets you should have? What are the risks you're taking, the safeguards, and how do you respond when you've heard about a cybersecurity incident? And then lastly, the final major category is digital literacy. And these are very, New York State has had digital literacy standards before. This is kind of an integration with and a recognition that these go hand in hand with computer science. Without digital literacy skills, you can't sit and use a computing device, right? So they are hand in hand, and you can use computer science skills to practice digital literacy as you create, share, and modify artifacts. So to have kept them separate was silly, and that was one of the very first thoughts that that the group agreed on back in 2018, is to say, no, these go together. So Andrea, I'll hand it over to you if you want to talk about helpful tools.
Sure. So if you go to the website, you will see these different options in order to click on. There's links there to click on, so that you can look at the standards by grade band, and then there's examples there, and then there's also standards at a glance that kind of dissect what a standard looks like and what's in it. So these are all on that website that I put the link in to the actual standards. It's pretty helpful. We talked about unpacking the standards a bit, and David, should I share that document?
Sure, you're welcome to do that.
Yep. So I'm just going to move out of here for a minute. Whoops, before we jump into interdisciplinary. In order to help with unpacking the documents, at NYSED this past year, we had a strand specifically on the new standards. And so Lisa Blank, who was on earlier, and Teresa Parker from Minisync, they actually created this document to help districts unpack the standards and really map where this is already taking place or where it can take place in your curriculum ultimately. So this is an example with computer science, with the cybersecurity standards, or rather concept area. These are the 3 sub-concept areas: risk, safeguards, and response. And if you go down, what we've done, actually David took this task on. We've got a couple documents that we can actually share links with you tonight if you want to jump into doing some of this work, but you'll see where the standard is here on the left, the concept area and the sub-concept area is here on the left, and identify reasons for keeping information private. And then the middle column is how might this be integrated into other subject areas. And then the last column is what can this look like in your classroom or district, and are modifications needed for the virtual classroom. And as you go down, I'll just scroll down over here. This is what it might look like in 7th and 8th grade. But you can see that it's set up similarly for all areas. Determine the types of personal information and digital resources that an individual may have access to that need to be protected. Now, one of the questions that Brian had was, would this be, required K-8 and then, electives in 9-12? Well, some of these, like this particular standard for cybersecurity, is really intended for all students, and it's not really a part of a class, a specific class. It's more global than that these are skills that we are looking for our students to have before they leave us when they graduate. So this is an example of 9-12, determine the types of personal and organizational information and digital resources that an individual may have access to that need to be protected. That's not something that would take necessarily, a student wouldn't take a computer science class for that. But where would a student be exposed to that type of information? And how might it be integrated into other subjects? And what would it look like in the classroom? So there's some documents. I will put the links to these unpacking documents in the chat. And you can take a look at them because they may have, they may be helpful to you. And Eric, yes, they're at every grade band. It is the hope that the students would have achieved those standards for every grade band and ultimately by graduation for all of them. Thank you. So
yeah, this document is meant to kind of address the group that's going to get together and say, how are we going to teach these in this grade band, or how are we going to cover these standards across the grades? This is a document to help, a tool to help begin those conversations and facilitate how can we look at these can already be checked off. We're covering this. We've done this. This fits in beautifully here. And so this is meant to be an open discussion across a variety of teachers, not just an administrator pushing this out and saying, okay, you're responsible for these standards, but really going in there and saying, hey, what's happening in your classroom that's reflected in these standards already that we can say, we've got this.
And also, every school district in New York State is different, right? And every school district is going to have a different way that they're going to look at the implementation of these standards. And so this is a document that you can use to customize what's happening in your district. The standards were not intended to be dogmatic in that regard, where this is what it's going to look like. That's why those specific examples were removed from the actual standard, and they created a separate document, that reflects possible examples of how these standards might be achieved. So I'll put the links in the chat in a moment, and right now I'm going to go back to our presentation.
Before moving on to the transdisciplinary piece, Lionel asks, do you think there are parts of the standards that will need to be taught in a CS content/curriculum?
I mean, I think that's true. No, David, is that right, David? Some of it will have to be, I think.
I think they were intended to be teachable in other subject areas, but some districts may choose to say, this is just going to be easier for us to accomplish if we make it a CS class, but they are not in any way intended to force districts to that as their way of implementing it.
No, 100%.
Yeah, so the other piece of this that we just wanted to talk about briefly was the idea of teaching these standards in a transdisciplinary way. So in a way that combines them. And if you go to the next slide. The goal of that being a couple of things. The first is equity. So when teaching the standards in a transdisciplinary way, all students are going to be able to be exposed to them, not only in a way that checks the box, but also in a way that shows them how those standards connect to the things that they're already learning and the things that they already like and know about and feel confident in. But the other big goal there is that certain big problems, and when we send this out, there's going to be links to the UN Sustainable Development Goals and the NAE Grand Challenges for Engineering. Those big problems can't be solved in isolation. There needs to be a transdisciplinary approach in order to take on those problems and to show students how they can be solved by working together using different backgrounds, including these standards. So just some examples of ways that these standards could be integrated into subject areas besides the computer science class, or ways that other classes can support a computer science class learning those standards. The first is in an ELA, this idea of using Mad Libs as variables, or taking the idea of proofreading and editing and presenting it as the same as debugging. So building those connections between something that a student already knows and is familiar with. The other way, or there are many ways, but these are just some examples we pulled out. This was a project done with an AP English class, as well as an art class. And those two classes worked together to code postcards based on where the character had gone in the book Swallows and Amazons. So that took a few different elements. The first was actually coding the postcard, so taking elements and customizing their postcards. But the others were reading the book, choosing a location, and actually working with the art class to take the visual language and the sort of design that was used in that time period and apply it to the different postcards. So sort of a really great example, and you can see the examples on the right of using a lot of different knowledge and research to come up with a really strong final product. Just a few other places, and I think we can jump to the hackathon slides after this. Go back really quick, sorry. So the other really strong connection is just social studies and ELA and digital literacy. So a huge part of digital literacy is going to be finding multiple sources, finding information online. And there's so much of that your students are already doing that ties back really well into the digital literacy standards piece. The last thing here before we go into the Q&A is just this idea of hackathons. So this was actually a hackathon that took place at Highland Falls in the 7th grade class, I believe.
Sixth.
Sixth. I was a volunteer there. It was absolutely amazing. And it was this incredible way, even like outside of a traditional classroom, to see these standards getting implemented in a way where students were able to see the connection to the real world and to the impact they were having right away. So in this hackathon, students went into town and interviewed business owners to see about the problems that they were having, really anything like related to tourism, related to business. And then they came back together and used design thinking to figure out what kind of products they could create to help those local businesses. And then they came together and they coded prototypes of those products. And it was absolutely incredible. And it really had them engage in like creating and computer science in a way where they were able to have this product at the end that the business owners could actually use and look at. So very quickly, they were able to build those connections between what they were doing, in this case in school, and having an impact in the real world. So that's a bit outside of an interdisciplinary classroom, but it's also a really great example of it. And just remembering to have fun. That's all. So from here, we just wanted to give everyone a chance to ask questions. We put aside 10 minutes. It looks like we have 8 minutes left of that. This is a lot of information, and there's a lot of really awesome people here who are thinking about what to do with their districts. So we have some prompts here, but just want to leave it open to have questions in the chat. And that's all.
I'm
It looks
excited to
like,
see some of the questions that have been happening so far, where it's clearly you are starting to see, okay, how is this actually going to work in our district? And that's exactly what this awareness stage is, you know, knowing that they're here and recognizing, how do we get our district, how do I get my classroom, how do I get my school towards implementing these? There are no simple answers to this, and there's no one answer that's going to work across all schools. This is New York State. We've got from New York City all the way up to the tiny little towns up in the North Country. We've got a lot of diversity, which is awesome, because to be able to think that students will graduate from New York State schools with these standards as a fundamental baseline for being active community members, this is what's going to lead them forward as we start thinking about self-driving cars on the road, and knowing that students have a fundamental computer science and digital fluency baseline. Yes, New York State did set aside a large chunk of money for professional development, and thank you, Stephen, for mentioning. I think it was Stephen who had mentioned applications for that funding. I know that state ed has kind of hit pause on a bunch of funding issues as a result of this silly little pandemic thing. So that will be, no doubt, that was done knowing that these standards were coming. So there is PD coming. So it's not the folks are out there. However, there are amazing resources in the communities already. Andrea mentioned NYSED. VidCode has an incredible community around it. The Computer Science Teachers Association, there are various groups around New York State of already computer science teachers who are teaching this, that I strongly encourage you reach out and make those connections with folks that want to collaborate with you.
Yeah, and I'm seeing some other questions about the Carmen asked, my district is asking librarians to implement these standards. Do you plan to have a crosswalk with the AASL standards? I think at some point crosswalks will be developed. I would guess that the first crosswalk to be developed would be the one with the New York State Next Generation Learning Standards. So I haven't seen anything like that yet, but I'm sure that that's something that will come out. And I think it is important because there are very strong connections between these standards and the New York State School Library Standards, as well as AASL. Some other questions, and in terms of professional development materials right now, I know that some BOCES are developing them. Laurie Guillaume was on our last call last week when we did Hudson Valley Ed Tech meetup. That BOCES, I think that's MORIC. They're developing some resources too, and they'll be holding professional development. And I know the BOCES will be doing that soon. Go to the state's website, because right now, everything that you need to build awareness about what this means for your district can be found there. Broken down by grade band, broken down by concept area, with the charts and the documents that are there. There's a lot of rich information that you can bring back to your district to start these conversations. And I'm actually going to stop sharing for a moment so I can grab those links to the unpacking documents that David created, so that I can share those links with you. There's 3 that have been completed to date, and you can access those. Those are in the chat now.
So in addition to the Q&A, I'd love to hear just some of the prompts that were on that slide. So what do you find surprising about the standards? And what do you feel like you need to, and what are you most excited about? And what do you feel like you need the most support around? You being everyone in attendance. Cool. Well, if there are any other questions as we wrap up here, there have been some links to different resources And then I'll put my email in as well. Feel free to reach out and I can connect you with both of our speakers here and we can answer any questions afterwards. Yeah, Stephen is saying, I think PD is important to get a deep dive into the standards. Absolutely.
Darcy has a comment, Leandra, about does anyone have a suggestion for an online coding program that is signing your DPAs? I believe that VidCode is EdLaw 2D compliant, is it not? I know you mentioned that last time.
Yeah, so we're in the last 2 minutes, so it's a great opportunity to sort of wrap up here. So just for a plug really quick, my name's Leandra. I don't think I introduced myself when I introduced the speakers, which is crazy. But I am the co-founder of VidCode. We're the organization that organized this whole thing. We are a computer science learning platform for 4th through 12th grades, really focused on student creativity and integrating computer science across subject areas. We are EdLaw 2D compliant, and I'll be sending out some information for everyone who signed up, as well as the recording and the slides here. Yeah, thank you all so much for coming. We're at 3:44 right now, so I don't want to keep anyone over, but please share the slides out with your colleagues who are interested in learning more about the standards, who have questions about them. And like I said, if you do have any other questions and want to email them over, I can connect you with our presenters, our experts here, and they can help you get started and help give you resources to spread information as well. All right, thank you so much, everyone. Have a wonderful rest of your evening.